this is a bee that looks just like a bee, and you're just not going to be able to see it. You might be able to do something if you're really good at taking photographs, right? But again, here's your problem. The flowers are way up high. As you know, when you're collecting pollen, you're using different kinds of lift trucks and things. Well, the good thing is that you are messing around with a lot of pollen, which means that you have an opportunity to collect, which is what's going to be required. Some of the bees, when you're doing your surveys, if you wanted to do this and preserve them, which is nothing more than freezing them if you wish, but you're not going to be probably doing a whole lot more. I should also mention that when I'm out there and when others are out there, you'll see a lot of different things on there. There's a community of bees that are using this, some of which are like chestnut. Why not? I love chestnut. I'll have some, and then I'll go over to the field and have some, fill in the blank other flowers, like bumblebees, for example. Carpenter bees are also using this. And then there's a whole bunch of other andrena, little tiny bees that are the size of smaller than a grain of rice. There's lots going on, and there could be even more specialists, although my guess is not. This may be it. But we don't know because we don't have hardly begun to look at these things. Here's a male. Males are basically a slimmer and lighter form of the females, but they look different, so you wouldn't necessarily do that. Technically, this rear end of the male is pretty distinctive with other characters, but again, you're not going to be able to see that in the field. Here's the male, slightly longer antennae. They have an additional antennal segment, as do all bees, and it fits in with all the other species of andrena in terms of its general patterns, and looks like a whole bunch of the others. So again, I'm just emphasizing the fact that this is not oh, I can see them, there they are, kind of a situation. Technically, Andrena renyi may or may not sit in its subgenus. So there's some interesting questions in terms of its taxonomy. It may be its own thing. So within the genus Andrena, people partition things around. I'm going to guess that Andrena renyi might be sitting separately from a lot of other species if people actually look under the DNA hood on that one. So I throw that out for people who specialize in this kind of thing. Okay, I'm wrapping it up now. I just want to mention that this whole tree thing has gotten us interested in the role of trees, and other researchers too. So we're not the sole people looking at this, but there's not many. And we're just beginning to realize that there's probably more going on than we thought. Honeybee people have known that trees are a dominant source of pollen and nectar for their hives, and see in the east associated with tulip poplar, black locust, I think the maples, big pumps of pollen and nectar, and even weight gains in their hives, which are reflecting the amount of honey produced when those species bloom. But the wild bee people have really not caught on. They're too busy going out into fields and going within net reach of things on the ground and looking at their relationships there. The trees they're tall, right? So they're harder to look at. So we have said that there are no real tree specialists out there, and now we've disproven that by finding Andrena renyi's relationship. We have some suspicion that black gum, as an example of another tree of interest, may also fall into that category. We leave that for another day and more investigations. So wrapping it up here, if we look at this as a interesting situation where scientists, natural history people, and people who are interested in the conservation and preservation of American chestnuts, i.e. the foundation, could get together, then pretty easily we could answer some very basic questions like, so the simplest one is like, what's the distribution of Andrena renyi on these orchards in North America? Both, I assume that there's orchards outside of the original range. I don't really know, but be that as it may, we could then expand it to like wild wild blooming American chestnuts, we could include the chinkapins, which I hope you would do, particularly because I'm not sure that anyone knows what the chinkapin, that's the threatened species, Ozarkensis, has going on for pollinators. Is Andrina rennie out there? I doubt that anyone's looked. We could then expand it to all bee species, which you almost have to do because you would have to collect at least the general mid-sized bees to be, all of them to be certain that you had caught Andrina rennie if you're doing a sample. So that would be an interesting part. There are potentials for expanding it to a project where you would look at all these different kinds of chestnut obligates, right? So you're concerned with chestnut trees and saving them, but you're equally, but indirectly, going to be saving a whole bunch of other species. And wouldn't it be cool to add that as a component to what the trust does in a very direct and directed way? So I think it would be a nice addition to also be tracking some of these other species that you are going to bring back. There's also lots of questions. Who lives on Chinese chestnut? Who lives on the other species of chestnut? And who is really just locked into our North American chestnuts? And then dividing that further into chinkapins of 2 species and American chestnuts. Super interesting, at least to me, in terms of its questions. There's many more questions that are a little bit outside my lane in terms of pollination ecology. You know, how important is Andrina rennie versus other bee species versus wind pollination, and for all these groups, and how do all these things interact? So with that, I'm going to, here's information that may be of interest to people. So my email address is here. We have a field guide down there at the bottom that you can just look up the field guide, Google, rather than try and copy all that. We maintain Flickr, Instagram, and Tumblr sites. Our Flickr catalog is where we keep all these pictures that you've seen here. We have a catalog of 4,500 now, I think, different pictures. They're all public domain. You don't have to ask. We don't want you to ask. Just take them and use them. And on Instagram and Tumblr, we go into lots of details about the life history, tell stories, and we encourage people to follow us to show that the Native Bee Lab matters to somebody. That's a nice thing that we can, when we have to fly up our reason for existence, up the political flagpole, having a lot of followers, a good thing. So I'll stop there. We can take questions, or I look to the people who are running the show to tell me the next steps.
Yeah, so I think that I think there are a few questions. I actually have a question or two for you, but why don't we start off with whatever Kendra might have for questions in the chat.
Sure. So as a reminder to folks, we're going to use the Q&A primarily for questions. I think there are a few in the chat. I'll try to get to those, but if you want to throw them into the Q&A to make my life easier, I wouldn't mind, just so we don't miss them. Sam, Nathan asks, are non-native chestnut, I think you kind of mentioned this a little bit at the end of your talk, but are non-native chestnuts like Chinese chestnut beneficial to native insects? Many non-native trees are not, like Bradford pears. Have any studies of native caterpillar utilization of non-native chestnuts been performed?
I don't know about the caterpillars. I do know that having looked at and collected off of Chinese chestnuts, but never finding Andrina rennie, but also not doing it a whole lot, that there are plenty of insects that are using the pollen and nectar of that tree. So nectar, the way to think about nectar in general is nectar is just a, you know, stop at the 7-Eleven and have a Slurpee. So everyone wants that, but they're not going to live off it. Well, maybe most people are not going to live off it. So the pollen is where you get into the specialization. So the fact that a Chinese chestnut attracts a lot of bees, they may be there just for like a quick drink, because nectar rarely is as filled with toxins as the pollen is. The pollen has lots of secondary compounds and has really not just Chinese chestnut, but all pollens. And they come with all kinds of different sets of secondary compounds that can be repellent to toxic for certain groups of insects, and also all kinds of proteins, lipids, and long chain things that are food for the young in most cases, but sometimes food for predators, i.e. beetles mostly, which you'll see a lot on in terms of the catkins. And those are mostly just scavenging the pollen to eat for themselves. So I can't quite answer that. So I would also, in the what I just talked about in terms of investigating pollen ecology and what species of bees are involved, expanding that to include the non-natives, particularly the Chinese chestnut, which is relatively commonly planted, from what I've been able to see.
Yeah, and kind of a related question, Sam, is from James. Have there been any records of the bee on Chinese chestnut? Kind of like the last question. But he's also wondering if we go out and check local chestnut flowers for this bee species, what are some of the other bees that might be there on Castanea that could be confused with? Would there be any other Andrina species or other things they might find?
Yeah, so when we collect, we identify everything, and I've found in just a little bit of collecting that I've done that there's a whole bunch of Andrina on the flowers that I have found. And I think that if we were able to look at other people's records, you'd find even more. And that if we did a really expansive one, list, we would be in the dozens of species of Andrina alone. And then many other species are on those flowers. Again, how much they're using the pollen and how much they're using the nectar, not known. And one would hope that someone interested in the pollination ecology of the plants in terms of a, just to have a better idea of what the conservation of the tree might be, because when you collect pollen by hand, and do your cross-fertilization kinds of things, that's a different mechanism than how insects are doing it. So that could be an issue, might not be an issue in terms of how a bee or other insect, but mostly it's going to be bees, is moving your pollen and nectar among plants and what that looks like versus actual wind, how much of that is actual wind, and also how you do it. So lots to address there.
Sticking with our international theme of chestnuts for a moment here, Paul is wondering if Andrina renyi is found in European chestnut orchards, if you know anything about its presence in Europe.
No, it is not. There is a literature, and I think a much larger literature, of the insect ecology of particularly the European, what is it, the sweet chestnut, Satia, so I can't recall. But I haven't looked into that in any kind of detail. I am not aware that in Europe and Asia that there are specialist bees of their own. They have equally as many Andrina species over there, and other species too that could effectively be specialists. That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't heard of any.
Okay. Dave wonders, how do we know that Andrina renyi doesn't feed on other plants' pollen?
We don't. So the gold standard would be to, first of all, backing up, we just haven't collected this bee at all. There's been a lot of collecting of bees on lots of different plants, and now the patterns match a bee specialist on chestnut, the original range, the fact that it disappeared from collections for so many years, and now it's only a recent appearance being solely on chestnuts. So that's strong but indirect evidence. So what you would need to do in the right way is to continue to collect off of chestnuts and collect flowers in the area of these chestnuts, grab any Andrina renyi and do a pollen analysis of their pollen loads to see, and it could be in the nest, but nests are, for almost all these bees, are almost impossible to find. So you'd be finding females, scraping the pollen off. Sometimes now molecular techniques work well,